Hello, my name is Cédric Durand. I'm economist at the University of Geneva and the Centre d'économie Paris Nord. I'm a political economist interested in the dynamic of contemporary capitalism in a broad Marxist and institutionalist perspective. My research focused on globalization, financialization, and the role of intangibles. I've recently co-authored a paper with William Milberg on intellectual monopoly in global value chains. Another recent contribution with Bruno Carballa and Stephen Knaus deals with uneven development in patterns in global value chains. And my latest book in English explores the hegemony of finance using the concept of fictitious capital. It was published by Verso in 2007. This MOOC proposes an analysis of the shockwaves of the COVID-19 pandemic on global value chains. It aims at to explore the lineages of the propagation of this sanitary economic shock along international trade networks and to assess the potential structural changes that could emerge as a result of this global trauma. Indeed, from the point of view of international political economy, the COVID-19 crisis is more than a wave of trade disruptions. It raises big concerns about the existential threats for societies resulting from hyper-efficient but highly dispersed supply chains. The issue of socio-economic resilience versus business optimizations opens a new dilemma for policymakers, which appears wide in the open with the debates about reshoring. We will examine these questions successively. First, I will expose the unfolding of trade disruption. Second, I will introduce the GVC perspective. Three, I will assess the vulnerabilities resulting from the international fragmentation of production. And finally, in four, I will conclude by examining the prospects for reshoring and the possibility of a retreat of globalization. The disruption in the global economy provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic and the policies implemented to contain it were of tremendous proportion during the spring of 2020. As the economic activity was depressed all around the world, trade and foreign investment shrunk dramatically, putting on hold a large part of the economic relations constitutive of globalization. Preliminary and prospective data for OECD countries indicates that trade is in free fall. For the second semester of this year, 2020, the OECD anticipates a decline of almost 50% year-on-year of trade in goods and services. As you can see on the graph, this is by far the sharpest reduction since the early 1960s. By comparison, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, the retreat of trade was only, if I may, 30%. Due to the second wave of the pandemic, the recovery of the third semester of 2023, which appears on the graph, is expected to be short-lived with a new drop at the end of the year. In the meantime, global foreign direct investment is also expected to plunge dramatically. The UNCTAD anticipates a drop of 40% in 2021 vis-à-vis pre-pandemic level. Foreign direct investment is a key variable in the deepening of globalization, with a more structural dimension than trade variation. Indeed, FDI refers to investment with an operational dimension, capturing the expansion of firms' managerial reach beyond frontiers. This retreat is expected to halve the level of FDI from its peak at 2015. These sharp retreats of trade and foreign direct investment are signaling an abrupt contraction of international economic relations. The global value chain perspective could help to understand the anatomy of this process. According to a canonical definition proposed by Kaplinski and Morris in 2001, the value chain describes the full range of activities which are required to bring a product or service from conception through the different phases of production, involving a combination of physical transformation and the input of various producer services, delivery to final consumer, and final disposal after use. The GVC perspective is thus oriented toward vertical economic relations through which commodities are produced. It takes as a whole all the activity which contribute to the elaboration of a good or a service, from its design and the extraction of natural resources up to the final consumption. One of the specificities of this outlook is that it moves beyond methodological nationalism to analyze the unfolding of transnational economic interdependencies in the world market. As stressed by the World Bank, given that production processes in many industries have been fragmented and moved around on a global scale, global value chains have become the world economy's backbone and central nervous system. Looking at the world's largest 20 economies in 2008, the prevalence of global value chains trade is impressive. Between 40% for Brazil and 80% in the Netherlands of exports are integrated into global value chains, be it through foreign value-added content of exports, backward participation in dark blue, or domestic value-added embodied in third-party re-exports, what is called usually forward participation, and that you can see on the graph in light blue. The importance of global value chains participation stresses the density of interconnectedness within trade networks, 3 countries or more being one way or another involved in most exports in the world economy. One particular salient aspect of global value chains is that it is an organized form of the international division of labor. Indeed, international trade is only marginally made of market transactions between more or less equal actors. In fact, multinational corporations dominate international trade. According to the UNCTAD, these companies operating in several countries coordinate about 80% of trade. Either trade is intra-firm, or it involves multinational corporation on one side, or it involves firms under contractual agreement, such as franchising or contract manufacturing with multinational corporations. The implication of this is straightforward. Any attempt to understand the dynamic of global value chains through the current crisis cannot be set apart from a reflection on multinational corporation strategies. Going back to the sharp retreat of trade in the spring of 2020, one can identify 2 main drivers of global value chains disruption. The first driver is the propagation of the shock from the lockdown in some Chinese regions in January and February 2020. The province of Hubei, where the virus outbreak was first reported, is a case point in this process. Hubei accounts for only 4.5% of Chinese GDP, but it is a high-tech manufacturing hub home to local and foreign firms highly integrated into global supply chains in the automotive, electronic, and pharmaceutical industries. As a result, temporary closures of factories decided by authorities in this province to contain the spread of the disease caused disruptions in production on many continents. Satellite image that you can see of the port of Long Beach in California, published by the Financial Times, illustrate the physical propagation of the temporary closure of manufacturing facilities in Chinese cities along trade routes. One can observe a significant reduction in the number of containers in March 2020 compared with 1 year earlier. In this port, the activity has been reported to decline by 50 to 70% in comparison to a year before. Firms in Asia and North America were particularly exposed to this sudden stop of activity in China due to the centrality of this country in global high-tech manufacturing supply chains. Indeed, you can see that on this graph. On the vertical axis, you have the share represented by this specific country in the global exports of high-tech goods. And on the other horizontal axis, you can see the weight of Chinese supply chain inputs as a total of foreign inputs in export of these specific countries. And it showed that about a quarter of foreign intermediate inputs used in high-tech exports, defined as pharmaceuticals, chemicals products, machinery, motor vehicles, and other transport equipment, in the US, Japan, Korea, and Mexico, comes from China. And in Europe, producers were also affected by this shock, also less directly. For example, mid-February, Fiat Chrysler had to halt its production in its Kragujevac plant in Serbia because of a lack of audio system and other electronic parts sourced from China. In sum, the decision of Chinese authority to shut down a large part of the VAT was the first driver of global value chains disruption. This supply shock affected manufacturing facilities all over the world and triggered immediate global recessionary forces. The second driver resulted from the geographical shift amplification of restriction on human circulation. The IMF coined the term the Great Lockdown to design this moment in spring when around 1/5 of world population, an estimated 1.17 billion people, have been ordered to remain at home. In April and May, some form of work restriction were implemented in countries representing more than 90% of world employment. This, of course, deepened the supply shock with factories prevented to work and transportation network collapsing, but also services closing even more abruptly. This doubling down of the crisis to services drastically expanded the crisis on the demand side. With the surge in unemployment, poverty dramatically increases in developing and developed countries alike, while the better off increase their precautionary savings. Also, various forms of government support in rich countries helped to contain the fall of incomes. They were not enough to preserve consumption, and large part of businesses are still maintained afloat by various forms of subsidies. Moreover, countries have implemented a range of temporary mobility-related measures such as entry ban, exit guidelines, quarantines, and travel restrictions. This has resulted in a complete collapse of air travel, with 50 million of passengers travels in May 2020 against 400 million a year before. Air traffic represented only 17% on its previous year traffic. These measures of travel restriction have almost put an halt to international tourism, but have also made international business management much more complicated. Major annual events, such as the Geneva International Motor Show, the Media and Cultural South by Southwest Festival in Texas, and the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, have been cancelled. The cancellation of such trade shows and the disruptions of routine business travel have affected immediate trade relations, but they could also lead to long-lasting scars in international business networks. Overall, lockdown measures and travel restrictions resulted in asymmetric reduction of supply and demand, leading to a combination of bottlenecks and gluts with severe medium-term implications for the recovery. This figure from the OECD shows the share in global exports of key medical supplies necessary to deal with COVID-19 disease. We can see that, on the one hand, northern countries such as the US, Japan, and Germany play a dominant role in the provision of sophisticated medical equipment such as patient monitoring devices and masks with mechanical parts. However, it appears that less sophisticated, also absolutely important goods, such as textile face masks or rubber gloves, were mostly exported by southern countries like China, Malaysia, and Thailand. At the height of the pandemic, it came as a shock for many countries to realize that they do not have sufficient productive capacities in vital areas such as respirators, face masks, and swabs used to diagnose infections. It also appeared that they were lacking basic chemicals components for pharmaceutical drugs, and for mass delivery of tests. These penuries revealed that low prices resulting from very efficient global supply chains often goes hand in hand with over-reliance on few supply sources. Indeed, efficiency gains in globalization are in large part the result of production concentration in a handful of locations. The other side of the coin of efficient specialization is that when things go bad, when governments intervene to secure supplies in priority, some other governments lack the ability to address penuries. This is what occurred in many parts of Europe and the US during springtime 2020 for face masks, COVID-19 diagnosis kits, and mechanical ventilators. In addition to disruptions of manufacturing supply chains, penuries in medical supplies led to a rapid reconsideration of the merits of globalization, with a reassessment of the risk and downsides resulting from international fragmentation of productive forces. COVID-19 revealed rising political risk and increased cost of business disruptions related to global supply. These new factors came in addition to already relevant elements, such as some new possibilities of automation, the reduction of labor cost differentials with China, and the existing reputational risk associated with sourcing in countries with low labor and environmental standards. This is in the context of this COVID-19 crisis that we have heard passionate calls from the part of US, Japanese, and European officials in favor of reshoring and the launch of policy initiatives in this sense. For example, in April 2020, the EU International Market Commissioner Thierry Breton considered that Europe may have gone too far in globalization and become too reliant on one country, one continent. EU Trade Chief Phil Hogan acknowledged that we should reduce our trade dependencies that make us vulnerable. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel argued that the pandemic reveals that the need for a certain sovereignty here, obtained through a pillar of domestic production. Will reshoring rush materialize? It is not clear yet if a substantial retreat of globalization is underway. What is sure is that businesses are decided to resist fiercely any attempt to constrain them to do so. For example, the Confederation of Swedish Enterprises made a very clear statement on this issue in September 2020. It writes that relocation decisions should be made by companies themselves. Policies can provide incentives, such as free trade agreement or tax relief, to encourage companies to consider relocating. But government should not adopt measures that force companies to relocate production. As long as trade and investment regulatory framework do not evolve drastically, decisions on supply chains are made according to fundamentals like production cost and access to large markets like China. Most of those factors haven't changed decisively with the pandemic. Moreover, the imperative to relocate has diminished as widespread disruptions in global goods supplies finally did not materialize in the autumn 2020. And all in all, this suggests that from a business perspective, globalization will still be driven by pre-existing factors. Before the pandemic, some companies were already spreading risk by diversifying part of their production from China to countries like Mexico or Vietnam, while others were exploring some possibilities to relocate in automated factories. COVID-19 has encouraged this trend rather than created them. In other words, if manufacturing globalization is slowing down for some years already, governments will probably have to put a lot of money behind domestic procurement, or they will have to radically change regulation to effect a big shift in globalization. In the meantime, offshoring of white-collar service jobs is still very much a current trend, which could even accelerate with the learning effect resulting from the amplification of remote working. Our provisional conclusion should thus be that the immediate logistic and revaluation risk cost of the COVID-19 crisis will not suffice to produce a massive readjustment of globalization. However, this doesn't mean that there will not be deeper, more long-lasting effect. At an anthropological level, the experience of the Great Lockdown has already produced meaningful realignment of value. Globalization and efficient supply chains were an adequate mean to achieve faster and greater availability of a wide range of cheap stuff. As the pandemic forced many peoples to turn their back to what German philosopher Hartmut Rosa called the acceleration of everyday life, it's possible that new form of valuation of our relation to the world could emerge, where resonance will prevail over the growth of material prosperity, opportunities, and resources. If the socioeconomic demand for an improved quality of our relationship to the world emerge, it will have profound effects on globalization. Such demand-side changes could not only occur at the consumer level. Shortening of global value chains in order to increase the embeddedness of economic activities in local, social, and ecological territories will require the translation of collective preferences at the level of macro policies. This could take the following direction. First, higher labor and ecological standards. Second, weaker intellectual property rights in order to build solidarity links with countries of the Global South. Then capital control and FDI regulation. Then planning policy to stabilize the shared collective anticipation. Beyond competitiveness, also long-term international partnership at the sectoral level should be considered. Thank you.